But we begin tonight with the next phase of the historic first criminal trial of a former U.S. president. That is because the defense in Donald Trump's hush money election interference trial rested its case today. And counter to Trump's many claims, they rested without hearing a word from him on the witness stand. Closing arguments are scheduled to begin 1 week from today. And before the jury begins its deliberations, the judge will provide the jury with their instructions that outline what verdict jurors should deliver based on what they determined to be true through the evidence that was presented. Each word in those jury instructions is critical to whether Trump is found guilty or not guilty by the jury. This afternoon, Judge Juan Marchand heard from both prosecution and the defense as they argued about what language should be used to instruct the jury on the law. Of course, it is ultimately Marchand's decision what those final instructions will be. As for the 12-member jury, they left today following the defense's lone material witness, who may have been the worst defense witness possible, second to Trump himself. Robert Costello, the criminal lawyer with ties to Rudy Giuliani, who was trying to get Michael Cohen to hire him in 2018 as Cohen was facing federal indictment connected to this case, was back on the witness stand for a second day, trying to undercut Cohen's testimony. Instead, he wound up undercutting his own credibility as prosecutor Susan Hoffinger used his own emails against him, where he disparaged Cohen and showed that he was really working for Trump and not Cohen. In an email to his partner, Jeff Citron, Costello wrote, "Our issue is to get Cohen on the right page without giving him the appearance that we are following instructions from Giuliani or the president. In my opinion, this is the clear, correct strategy." In another email to Citron, Costello wrote, "Tune in to CNN and see how they are playing this up. Cohen has to know this, yet he continues to slow play us and the president. Is he totally nuts? What should I say to this a-hole? He is playing with the most powerful man on the planet." Perhaps the biggest surprise today is that the defense rested its case without even attempting to raise a defense about the actual case against Trump. All they seemed to do was attack Cohen, his credibility and his motives. Now, to be clear, a defendant is not obligated to make a case in a criminal trial. But in this case, Trump's defense team made a promise to the jury. During his opening statement, Trump defense attorney Todd Blanche made the claim that the jury would learn that the money Trump paid to Cohen in 2017 was not a payback, especially not a reimbursement for the money Cohen paid to Stormy Daniels. It was all just a retainer agreement because Cohen was Trump's personal attorney. And yet, the prosecution laid out 3 key pieces of documentary evidence that the defense failed to bring up, let alone counter at any time. There was the handwritten notes by Alan Weisselberg on the First Republic bank account statement showing the $130,000 wire transfer to Stormy Daniels' lawyer that notes the breakdown of the repayment plan to Cohen, including grossing up the amount to cover any tax liabilities and adding a bonus, which amounted to a total of $420,000. Then there was Trump's signed 2017 presidential public financial disclosure report that under the part marked liabilities included the line, "In the interest of transparency, while not required to be disclosed, in 2016, expenses were incurred by one of Donald J. Trump's attorneys, Michael Cohen. Mr. Cohen sought reimbursement of those expenses, and Mr. Trump fully reimbursed Mr. Cohen in 2017. The category of value would be $100,000 and $101 to $250,000. And if that's not enough, there was also Trump's own tweet from May 3rd, 2018. Yes, there is always a tweet where Trump admitted that the monthly payments were a reimbursement for Stormy Daniels' non-disclosure agreement. So no matter how much the defense will likely focus on Cohen and his credibility in their closing argument next week, they have no way to attack the credibility of the documentary evidence already presented to the jury that makes the case against Trump. Joining me now is Katie Phang, trial attorney and host of the Katie Phang Show on MSNBC. Danny Savalos, criminal defense attorney and MSNBC legal analyst. And Tristan Snell, former assistant attorney general for New York and author of Taking Down Trump, 12 Rules for Prosecuting Trump by Someone Who Did It successfully. Thank you all for being here. Katie, my sister, I have to start with you because I know you've been in court every day. I actually saw you in court the day that I got to be there and saw how diligently you are taking notes and paying attention. Throughout this case, have you heard any day, because maybe I've missed it in the Google Docs and transcripts and stuff that y'all have been sending me, was there any time at which the defense countered any of those three pieces of seemingly really important evidence that I just discussed?
No, and that's a really important distinction for you to raise, Joy, because as my esteemed colleagues on this panel know, the questions that are posed during cross-examination by the lawyers is not evidence. It's the answers that are elicited from the witness stand that ends up being the evidence. And so when you consider the attempts to cross-examine people like David Pecker, all the way to Michael Cohen with, a little bit of a detour through Stormy Daniels along the way, what testimony that was elicited from those witnesses, especially when they disagreed with the characterizations that were provided by Trump's counsel, that testimony from those witnesses is the evidence. And so when provided with the opportunity, and by the way, it's not like Judge Merchan told Trump that he only had a couple of days or a little bit of time to be able to put on a defense. What did we hear? We heard from a paralegal from Todd Blanche's law firm who said that actually he helped the prosecution and said that the 75 phone calls that the defense made it sound like was between Michael Cohen and with Robert Costello were actually not a total of 75, and that there were dupes that were included in there. But more importantly, you heard from Robert Costello. And so you would think at some point in time, someone on behalf of the defense would get up and explain not only what you just put up as the graphics, right, at the beginning of this segment, but what about that meeting in Donald Trump's office at Trump Tower after Michael Cohen met with Alan Weisselberg with that account statement from Essential Consultants LLC, where Donald Trump approved it verbally and signed off on the fact that Trump would then pay Cohen $420,000 for $130,000. We didn't hear anything about that. And so Trump had a lot of opportunities to be able to take down the credibility even more so of people like Michael Cohen, and he failed to do so. And so, of course, the jurors, as you noted, they're gone for 7 days, Joy. They recess today. They don't come back till Tuesday morning at 9:30. And as Tristan and as Danny knows, that's a long time for them to sit and think about the last thing that they heard. And the last thing they heard was bad stuff from Robert Costello.
Right. And the thing is, Danny, as a former defense attorney, I mean, here's the problem. They don't have to put on defense. They're not required. The obligation is on the prosecutor to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Donald Trump committed a crime. But the defense, to Katie's point, they left the jury with the guy who pissed off the judge. I've been a grand juror. I haven't sat in a jury. I was dismissed when and the last time they tried to call me for jury service, they were like, yeah, you get out. But I imagine that the judge is probably the most popular person in the room. And so if you're making the judge mad, I'm not sure you're very popular with the jury, whereas Michael Cohen was a calm witness who went methodically through, and the prosecutors seem to be quite brilliant, and they're good and succinct. What sense did it make to leave the jury with that bad taste in their mouth today? What did it accomplish?
It might have accomplished just satisfying the client if you're defense counsel, because I expect in a couple years we'll find out that Donald Trump really pushed to have Robert Costello on the stand, and that Costello himself really wanted to be on the stand. And frankly, when you're defense counsel, you're at the end of a trial, you're punchy, it's exhausting. The client wants something. Sometimes you just say, you know what, if that's what you want, we'll do it. But remember, if this comes back and blows up in your face, you were the one who wanted this to happen. You're right in that the defense has zero burden. But when the defense starts calling witnesses after the prosecution closes, they don't actually have any burden, but spiritually, to the jury, it looks like, hey, the defense wants to tell us something. Let's see what's so important. And you call 2 witnesses, and that's what you get out of them. Now you've left the jury with Robert Costello when you could have left them with Michael Cohen, who at best I think was a mixed bag. Definitely some good things for the prosecution, but there were a couple punches landed. To me, the most significant punch was the revelation that Michael Cohen literally stole money from this guy that the prosecution has painted as sort of having a Svengali hold over Cohen, and that all of Cohen's sins were only because he loved and adored and had this undying loyalty to Trump. Not so fast. He actually, Cohen, when the opportunity presented itself, he stole from Trump. That was a point to be made. But the bottom line is you could have left the jury with Cohen's cross-examination, essentially. Now they're left with Costello. It's awkward. It's a little strange.
But Tristan, is that even material? I mean, you wrote the 12 rules of prosecuting Donald Trump. is one of the rules that you have to have a pristine witness that's never done anything wrong? Because at the end of the day, Michael Cohen committed crimes for Donald Trump. And even that part of it that, respectfully, that what Danny talked about, I'm not sure how that's material. The question at hand, as I understand it, is did they pay off Stormy Daniels? Did Michael Cohen make that payment himself, committing crimes in the process? Did he expect to be paid back? And was he paid back? And did the Trump organization falsify their business records in order to do that? And was that entire scheme for the purposes of helping his campaign? That is what Pecker said is the case. That is what Cohen said is the case. That's why they gave Pecker a non-prosecution agreement. I don't see, if you want to say, Michael Cohen jaywalked 10 days a week and didn't know how to cross the street without running in front of a bus and messing up traffic, so what if I'm a juror?
Yeah, I think this is an area where jurors are going to have the common sense that if you're going to catch a criminal or an accused criminal, there might be some other unsavory people or people who did unsavory things that were around that guy. Like if you're going to get to that inner circle, you're going to find other people that were not doing particularly great things for the guy who's being accused of crimes.
But I mean, wait a minute. But wait, I'm sorry, not to correct you, but not doing unsavory things near him or for him. It's the same crime, Tristan. This is where I can't get away from this. Is that he went to jail for this crime, not a different crime, a separate crime. He didn't rob a separate bank. He went to jail for the same thing that Trump is now on trial for. Tristan, make it make sense. I'm not a lawyer, but I can't get away from that just as a normal person. The thing Michael Cohen went to jail for is this crime.
President Trump, are you going to testify? Yes.
You plan to testify in your trial in New York?
Yeah, I would testify, absolutely. It's a scam. It's a scam.
The gag order is not for testifying?
No, you won't stop me from testifying. The gag order is not for testifying.
Do you plan to testify in court?
Probably so. I would like to. I mean, I think so.
Okay. After weeks and weeks of saying he would, it turns out Donald Trump is not testifying in his first criminal trial. After all, this morning, the defense rested its case after only one day, calling no more witnesses after Robert Costello. And I guess since it's Trump, no one's really surprised at that. No one's really that surprised. But just imagine, if you will, what the reaction would be if it were any other former president on trial, if you could imagine any other former being on trial, and they failed to take the stand. Back with me, Katie Pham, Danny Ceballos, Tristan Snell. Danny, as a defense attorney, I'm sure you would never put someone like Donald Trump on the stand because you, of course, can't stop lying. But comment, if you will, on the fact that he did not and what impression that might leave.
Well, back when he promised, all I kept thinking was, ever since the whole Mexico would pay for the wall thing, I didn't believe a promise that Donald Trump was going to make about whether or not he was going to testify. And by the way, when it comes to white-collar cases, often you have defendants who think, if I could just get on the stand, I could explain all my problems away. And as the trial wears on, they realize what they're really in for. Maybe Trump really believed he was going to take the stand. I doubt it. In all likelihood, he was never going to take the stand in his own mind, no matter what he even told his attorneys. But in a way, the only person who ever knew for sure was Donald Trump, because he has an absolute constitutional right to take that stand. And he could have decided right up until the last minute whether or not he wanted to. So really, it wasn't even that much up to his attorneys, although they could strenuously advise him not to take the stand. The bottom line is few people can handle the crucible of cross-examination. And most defense attorneys, contrary to popular belief, we're risk-averse. I do not want to snatch defeat from the jaws of victory. If I think I have a shot at not putting on a case and not putting on my client, I don't want to be that courthouse myth of the guy. Did you hear about that guy who put his client on the stand and torpedoed his own case? So there was very little chance that Donald Trump was ever going to take the stand, no matter what he promised.
Yeah, and the cross-examination would have been brutal. Let me play Donald Trump today. Let me just give you an example of why, because his brain don't work good. I keep telling you all that. Here's Donald Trump today.
The judge hates Donald Trump. Just take a look. Take a look at him. Take a look at where he comes from.
Kristen, take a look at where he comes from. Judge Marchand Judge Marchand is from Colombia. And He pointed that out. Take a look at where he comes from. That is where he comes from. I just want to point out that another judge who comes from Colombia is Aileen Cannon, the judge that's saving his behind in the documents theft case. Another judge who comes from Latin America is Judge Curiel, who Donald Trump disparaged as he was finding against him in, as you very much well know, the Trump University case. What do you make of disparaging the judge's race as a tactic?
Not a great one, but also quite on brand for him, right? I mean, at the end of the day, a lot of the outside the courtroom antics are really for him to play to the media and cult that surround him and to be able to hit his followers up for money. So, you know, pushing that racism button is probably a good way for him to separate his followers from their wallets a little bit more. So sure, go ahead and go there. It's not going to affect what's going on inside the courtroom, but it's a tell and an on-brand one for him. But also, Danny's totally right about like how difficult it is to get Trump to do anything. I actually think we might have seen what would almost be the impossible. The fact that I think Donald Trump's lawyers actually might have convinced him to do something they wanted to do rather than something he wanted to do. I think he wanted to testify and he got talked out of it. Maybe he did chicken out a little bit too, but I think he actually probably thought he was going to get up there and be the smartest guy in the room and explain everything. And I think maybe finally, after the disaster of his testimony in the E. Jean Carroll case a few months ago, he has now realized that maybe that wasn't such a good idea, and his attorneys managed to push him away from testifying.
I feel like Katie has thoughts. I feel it.
He was never going to do it, right? I mean, he's crazy like a fox. I think that he has a lot of screws that are loose, but I do think he's crazy like a fox. And so he was never going to testify. I just think what's ridiculous about it, though, is, you know, we know, because to Tristan's point, there's an entire ecosystem that exists outside of that courtroom. But I want to be very clear. You seat a jury based upon them not having preconceived notions about this case, and you kind of screen out the people that maybe have too much knowledge about this. But there are two lawyers that are on this jury. Those two lawyers may not be criminal defense attorneys. They may not be former prosecutors. They may be big law or corporate lawyers right now. But they know that right to testify, and they know what that means. If you weren't going to testify, Donald, then where's Alan Weisselberg? Why don't you ship him in from Rikers? Why don't you have him explain your side of the story? Because you knew that that was also a loose cannon as well. And so I think the jury, you never underestimate their intelligence and their common sense. You're supposed to leave certain biases and prejudices at the door when you come in, and you're cloaked with the presumption of innocence if you're the criminal defendant. But we all know that they're not stupid and they're not ignorant about the reality of who Donald Trump is. And so maybe they wanted to hear from Donald, because I think it's human nature to want to hear from the other side. But I don't think anybody credibly believed that he was going to take the stand and actually say anything in his own defense.
Let me play Lanny Davis, who used to represent Michael Cohen. He's making sort of his closing argument sort of would be, and I want to get you guys' takes on what you think the actual closings will sound like. Take a listen.
The facts speak without Michael Cohen. He confirms, but he doesn't need to be believed because he's corroborated. Fact one, both Mr. Pecker and Hope Hicks say that the money paid to Stormy Daniels was politically motivated. That is a fact from their testimony, not Michael Cohen. Fact two, the Weisselberg document lists all the money that Michael Cohen was reimbursed, times 2 divided by 12, are checks Mr. Trump wrote for $35,000. Those are facts without Michael Cohen's testimony.
Let me give each of you, I'm going to put 30 seconds on the clock for each of you. Tristan, I'm going to start with you first. Does that sound like what you think you will hear in closing arguments? And do you think there'll be any surprise jury instructions?
I think that is what we're going to hear. I think Lanny Davis was pretty much right on that. I think that the emphasis you're going to hear from the prosecutors is, look at all these other witnesses, and the documents are even more important than the witnesses. I think that what we were talking about earlier in the show about all of those key documents, Joy, that you pointed out, I think the prosecution is going to go through those brick by brick by brick. Jury instructions, we got a little bit of a taste of it today from the talk from the pre-charge conference. I think one of the things that's key there is that the unlawful means that is at issue here, that the jurors can have different ideas about what that unlawful means were. So that I think that's really key there. It's basically, if they were falsifying records and up to no good while they were doing it, that'll get you there, basically.